GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network for our fourth segment of the day on the show. Like I said, we're continuing this narrative of positional rankings, continuing with our wide receivers specifically, and this is another one of those position groups where week by week they could prove to be more vital and matchups get harder to determine. With that being said, this list that I've compiled has been one of confusion, one of recognition, potentially one more hinged upon matchups than ever now that we're in the true depths of the season. So this one could be a little bit contentious, but just know that no matter what, these receivers all have the unique opportunities week in and week out to prove themselves, because that's what it's going to come down to for a lot of these positions going forward, especially. Which avenue are you willing to take? Sticking with your stars or abandoning ship and trying to find that next piece, whether it be through the waivers or through trade? And that's what you're going to have to decide. But these rankings are designed to delineate the kind of perspective or perception we have of superstar wide receivers from those that we have about guys who we may not have discovered just yet. So I'm trying to mix and match both. This perfect list that I have, in my opinion, compiled, is one that truly goes to show the depth of this position. Without further ado, let's jump right into my wide receiver ranks for Week 9, starting off with a guy who you never know if he's going to be a good fantasy performer week in and week out. I have to put up with it because he was my top overall pick in my draft this year and is someone who felt like he was going to maintain his level of dominance at the wide receiver position and feeling a little bit hard done by because of his performances. But this is still a guy who is an elite receiver when you look at this in the grand scheme of things. Amon-Ra St. Brown. This is a very important divisional game because this game will prove against the Packers, that is, whether or not the Lions merit consideration as the best team in the NFL and a true Super Bowl contender. Because of the fact that, they've been winning these games against these teams that may not be well enough equipped to handle what the Detroit Lions bring to the offensive side of the football. They're going up against a Packers team that, while their defense, has been impressive, still feels like they're just waiting for someone to exploit them. Because one of the important things they do is generate turnovers. But the Lions are so efficient in how they run their offense, so efficient in every single operation on the field, it's going to be difficult to really slow any one part of their game down. So that's why I feel like Amon-Ra St. Brown, even though I could have mentioned any Lions wide receiver or tight end or skill position player for that matter, is someone who's going to be the X factor in this one, because we know that the Packers secondary will be lively in this one, will be very active, especially Xavier McKinney. But in terms of what I want to see from the Lions offense, I feel like in late down situations or in the red zone, Amon-Ra St. Brown will be called into question. And there will be times where he'll have to make plays for his team going forward. And it'll be on him to deliver, but I do think that in this game, he holds a lot of weight in the outcome. Not just for this game, but for the entire division perhaps, because of his importance to this Lions team. And not for nothing, I do believe that the Lions will win this game and cover the spread. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the week. But I want to see Amon-Ra St. Brown step up against an opponent of this caliber and prove that he's still a viable fantasy asset and still one of the best wide receivers in the league. Now let's go to a little bit more of a skeptical pick. This is a pick that I kind of made hastily, as always, before the Week 8 games were played. And I still think it's viable, but it's contingent on, this offense relying a little bit more on the secondary pieces that it has at its disposal. Because this guy really can be an asset, both in real life and in fantasy, if he gets going. That is Rashad Bateman. Last week, to follow up his breakout performance against the Bucks, kind of had a stinker against Cleveland. 3.8 fantasy points, albeit against a very tough secondary to play against. But going up against a Broncos secondary that is also very tough to play against, even sans Pat Surtain II, I feel like Rashad Bateman will prove that against elite defenses, that he has the physicality to keep up with them. That's the big thing that I really love about Rashad Bateman, his physicality for this Baltimore Ravens offense. Because when you look at Lamar and Derrick Henry, they're the perfect blend of both. Lamar brings the speed, he brings the out-of-structure agility. Derrick Henry brings the physicality and the breakaway speed to reach the second level on some of his runs. In the receiving game, it just left a lot to be desired in terms of, the effectiveness of, say, Flowers, Mark Andrews not really getting his head in the game, Isaiah Likely having to carry some of the receiving load, and then Rashad Bateman kind of being forgotten about throughout the season. But he proved that against Tampa Bay as Chicken Wing enters the chat. How are you, my friend? Welcome to the show. Rashad Bateman can be someone who, in a matchups-oriented way, is going to be effective in terms of what he can do for this squad, this Baltimore Ravens team, looking for a spark from their receivers to really make this a diverse offense that's capable of winning a Super Bowl. And I was going to show it against a Broncos secondary that really has been impressive, even outside of Pat Surtain marshaling that back end. So look for this team to, look for Rashad Bateman especially, to really break out again in this game. The third receiver that I want to talk about is someone who, has had his games where he's put up the numbers we expect him to, but also hasn't necessarily been someone to write home about from a fantasy perspective. This is another one of my guys on my personal fantasy team who I also kind of have to accept, much like Amon-Ra, DJ Moore. And this is someone who I greatly respect for what he can mean to this team, but I want to see it translate a bit more to his actual play. 5.4 fantasy points this past weekend versus Washington, and going up against the Cardinals defense that he should be able to exploit. I feel like this will be another get-right game for him because he's had, like I said, performances throughout the season where he's not necessarily, I will get to your question, Chicken Wing, in just a moment. He's looked like an elite wide receiver for the Bears offense. But there have been moments where he just doesn't show up and is non-existent in the passing game. And he needs to step up week in, week out for Caleb to look as good as he will in the future. So, against this Cardinals defense, look for him to get right against an easy opponent on the defensive side of the ball. But Chicken Wing has asked me about my thoughts on Waddle. And, I feel like Waddle is someone who I can't really gauge from a fantasy perspective. As, he addresses that I was doing my thing, but I'm now addressing your question, my man, because it is a good one. Because of the fact that Jalen Waddle has been called into question by myself, by a lot of fantasy football managers probably, and most importantly by Dolphins fans. I feel like if you're a Dolphins fan, you should be worried about what Jalen Waddle brings to this offense, because he is, at the end of the day, someone who you like as your wide receiver too in an NFL offense. But he hasn't necessarily proven in real life and fantasy that he can have sustained success. I mean, there are performances where he proves that it's not just the Tyreek and Tua show, or the Devon Achane show, or Raheem Mostert show, but they've been few and far between, and I feel like his value is plummeting as the season progresses, and as the Dolphins just become a little bit more centered around certain players rather than a collective whole, if you know what I mean. So I feel like the stock is out on Jalen Waddle, and he is someone who I don't necessarily see really helping bolster your fantasy squad going forward. But thank you for your question. Good luck to you and your fantasy football exploits, my friend, and have a great rest of your day. But let's get back to DJ Moore here. Long story short on him, he just needs to find his rhythm. And against teams like the Cardinals, I feel like he can. But now let's go to the last receiver that I picked here, which is ironic because he is Jalen Waddle's teammate, Tyreek Hill, against the Bills. Now, this game last time, obviously, marred by Tua's concussion, but overall not a pretty day for the Dolphins wide receivers either. The Bills are one of those teams that are very comfortable playing against divisional opponents, especially a divisional opponent such as Miami, where you have to account for the speed of the guy like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and Devon Achane and Raheem Mostert. But in this matchup, I feel like, there can be vulnerability to what the Bills can do here, because I feel like if McDaniel simplifies the playbook, even with Tua now back from his injury, there can be holes that you can exploit if you're the Dolphins. You don't necessarily have to take your vertical shots all the time against a team like the Bills, because they know what's coming and they're willing to defend in zone, defend in space, and clamp you down. But if you're willing to take those underneath shots, you can open up a lot of yards after carry in space and exploit their sideline to sideline defense. So look for this team to try and stretch this Bills defense horizontally rather than vertically. And if they do that, then Tyree can have a big day. We saw glimpses of him back with Tua reunited as that QB wide receiver duo and what it could mean for this Dolphins team with 13.2 fantasy points against Arizona. But in a tougher divisional matchup that I feel like they need to win in order to have any semblance of a quote-unquote playoff contender, then you're going to have to diversify what he's going to do. As Steve Cicciarella, hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly, asked, dude, what is the, I believe, over, under, or plus minus on this? I'm going to have to check because I haven't really looked at any of the over-unders just yet for this game. I'm always willing to look at them throughout the week because I know they're subject to change. But let me see here. Don't think they have it. Might have to look it up on ESPN really quickly. But it looks like the Bills are 3.5 point favorites in this game. 6.5 point favorites, rather. The money line obviously heavily favoring Buffalo in this one at minus 295. Miami's at plus 240 for this one. The over-under is at 47.5 points. So as you can see, not necessarily a game where the Dolphins are favored, but if they can get Tyreek Hill his opportunities, then he can exploit them. And I have high hopes for him this week. But that would just about do it for this segment. Coming up, my final segment of the day. My favorite news segments on this show, fact versus fiction. Are some bold fantasy takes that I've come up with justifiable or debatable? We'll see after this short break to end our show.